I'm going to cover the Bardic traditions of the Celtic cultures. And I suppose I should define what I mean by Bardic. I mean, it's sort of intuitively obvious, I guess, but um, I'm maybe using it in a broader sense than some people might. I think some people associate a bard with some sort of musician or minstrel. Some people probably think, by manner of word association, poet. Some people probably have a notion of bards or bardic activity as embracing both music and poetry. But certainly there are words involved, that it's singing or chanting or that sort of thing rather than instrumental music. And that is at the heart of the traditions I'm going to be talking about. Poetic work, certainly down through the ages, down through the generations since the pre-Christian era, there are musicians involved in this, harpists particularly, that sort of thing. And even in ancient times, we have references to the harp as one of the tools of the ancient bards. There is an association between perhaps the harp and Druidism in times of old. But you could think more broadly, and I've touched on this in previous lectures, of the bardic work as being perhaps part and parcel of the training and development of the various professionals who go to make up the Druidic class. That when we talk about things like the oral transmission of tradition, of lore, of genealogies and that sort of thing, or even the legal precedents, that's all part of the same sort of training, and it is the sort of training that survived many hundreds of years into the Christian era in the training of the poets, of secular poets within Irish and Welsh society and elsewhere, really. So in addition to the actual work, the actual, if you will, end products produced by bards and poets and others of their ilk, you can also think about what goes into the development of those skilled professionals, those people who produce that end product. And then, as I say more broadly, of an entire attitude and approach to developing those people so that they could adequately fill their roles in the society, of years of training, and as I say, of the repetition and recitation of material that was transmitted to them orally. In addition to that, there's one could say visionary component to the work. Some people might call it ecstatic. Some people might want to use the word shamanic or shamanistic. Other people sort of cringe at that and feel that that term doesn't specifically belong to the Celtic traditions. But in any event, there's no arguing the notion that the work of some of these poets in the traditional Celtic cultures was seen as visionary, no pun intended. That even one of the words, and I think I've alluded to this before, fili, has a root in a word that refers to seeing things in the sense of saying, I see that, meaning I know, or I see what you mean to mean I understand what you're saying. Awen is a Welsh term that relates to, it's usually translated as poetic inspiration. Imvis is often translated in the same way. That's an Irish word that has a pretty ancient lineage. Awen, maybe not so ancient. I don't know how far back the roots of that particular word go in Welsh. But there is absolutely a sense of the work of poets, of bards as being inspired. That one seeks to achieve a certain kind of inspiration which permits one to divine certain things or perhaps have vision, and that's all very much at the heart of the work of bardic professionals in the traditional Celtic cultures. And the words Awen and Imbus are frequently used to reference this, what in one ancient verse is usually translated as the fire in the head. That's from a sort of ancient, supposedly, what's believed to be one of the oldest Irish verses. Um, in Irish society, and really elsewhere, I think it's probably equally true in Scotland and Wales, and probably in Brittany, um, the secular poets were, in many ways, the inheritors of what was left of the work of the Druid classes within Christianity, and particularly after the English culture in Ireland and elsewhere in the British Isles became preeminent. And I think the same can be said for when French culture started to overtake the Breton culture, the Celtic culture of the Breton speakers. A lot of the ancient traditions were suppressed for a variety of reasons. One, they were no longer part of what had become the dominant culture. They were part and parcel of the earlier indigenous culture, which was being suppressed by imperialist domination. There was, allied to that, a sort of a political expediency to suppressing some of these cultural institutions. If you strip away the cultural institutions from people whose land you're colonizing, perhaps you succeed in taking away their heart. And as you do that, perhaps you lower their willingness to resist occupation. And of course, there was also the suspicion that, and in some cases rightly so, that the Bardic institutions, that the office of the ancient poets, when it was being exercised at its fullest, was allied far too closely to pagan, i.e. non-Christian, i.e. heathen, religious activity. And so through imperialism, through the religious imperialism of the advent of Christianity in the British Isles and elsewhere, much of the fullest expression of poetic, particularly sacred poetic work, was gradually stripped away. And what was left was elements of vestiges of the training practices, the methodology for training these professionals, and some institutions which you could say were sort of debased. There were, in ancient times, poetic competitions. Part of the work of becoming a Fili, one of the elevated poets in Irish society, was to acquire a mastery of quite a large number of very specific and difficult meters, metrical patterns, rhyme schemes, and rhythm schemes that one composed in. There were certain formal metrical arrangements for verse that were considered appropriate for elevated composition, right? For sacred perhaps, and certainly for kind of state occasions and for sacred use. And one could perhaps compete in composition using one or another of these meters. This tradition of competition between bards lasts down into probably at least the 16th and 17th, I don't think quite the 18th century in Ireland. There are certainly vestiges of this in Wales as well. In Wales, there's a remnant division between kind of court verse and secular or more popular verse. And that shows up in Ireland as well. There is a division between the work of the Fili and the mere bard as you get further on into more and more contemporary Irish history, where the bard was doing eulogies and praise poetry, and as opposed to what the work of the Fili had once been, which was to do not only that work to some degree, but also verse that would have been involved in ritual practice and religious practice within the society. The Celts weren't the only Indo-European language cultures that had this sort of activity going on, and I want to touch on some of the other Indo-European cultures that had bardic activity, at least throw out some of the names of the professionals within those cultures, and hopefully give a sense of a kind of a larger context for what I'm talking about specifically within the Celtic world. Hopefully lay out a sense for you of just how important the work of the poet was in the spiritual lives of these ancient cultures. We have names for any number of different, I'll call them sacred poets, in various Indo-European societies. I mentioned one, I think, in a previous lecture, in pre-Hindu India, or maybe even in Hindu culture. I don't know that much about Hinduism per se. There was a chanting priest in the rituals who was called the Hotar. You may be familiar with the tradition of skaldic poetry in the Germanic cultures. You can, if you buy a collection of the so-called poetic Edda from the Scandinavian cultures, from Iceland, you'll see good examples of what's called skaldic, S-K-A-L-D-I-C, verse. And these are often odes that celebrate the gods and goddesses of the Scandinavians. Homer, among the Greeks, wrote any number of verses within his canon of writing that were concerned with mythological topics. The Greeks were quite fond of different forms of poetic expression, including in their drama. Some of you may be aware. The great tragedies and comedies of the ancient Greeks were written in verse. And originally, as again some of you may be aware, the tragedies grew out of celebration of the god Dionysus, that gradually became more elaborate. Great theaters that could seat up to 20,000 people or so were built to accommodate what were increasingly elaborate plays. By elaborate, I mean they went from having one performer to two to ultimately three actors plus a chorus. So they never had casts of thousands or even dozens, but they did take on more and more importance in the society, in civic life, if you will, and did become more elaborate in terms of their composition and content. They were religious occasions, the performance of these tragedies. We find the notion of poetic inspiration as a sort of gift of the gods, as an undercurrent in many of these cultures. We've touched on Howland, the Welsh term already, and the Irish word imbas, which can be seen spelled as I-M-B-A-S, or sometimes you'll see it in, I think, a modern Irish form as I-O-M-A-S. I don't think that's actually modern Irish. I think that's an alternate Old Irish spelling, or maybe it's Middle Irish. So I-M-B-A-S is the most common spelling you'll see, but you'll also see I-O-M-A-S. And specifically, you'll see a specific technique of seeking poetic inspiration for the purpose of divination and perhaps composition called the imbas forosni, F-O-R-O-S-N-A-I. And this was banned within Christian society because it was said to rely on invoking demons in the eyes of the Christians, which would have been the pagan gods and goddesses. Composition, the creation of verse, is seen as a creative act. It's seen as not only bringing things into existence, but bringing them into a kind of ordered existence. And I think the emphasis on traditional forms, right, customary and appropriate meters for poetic composition, right, established rhyme schemes and rhythmic patterns, rote memorization, as we've seen in the Vedic example, where the Sanskrit verses of the various Vedas were passed down for perhaps 1,000 years through unchanging rote memorization from generation to generation. The word was the single most, at least in my interpretation of the history and the mythology and what we know of these ancient societies, some of which were non-literate, the word was the preeminent sacred act, the preeminent sacred tool. And that just as the gods ordered the cosmos, so the poet and the other members of the various priesthoods were responsible for upholding that order within human society, and one could say reenacting the ordering of the universe within the ritual universe, if you will, the cosmos of the ritual and the order that was established there, the verses that were sung, chanted, spoken in customary manner, were seen as, in the eyes of some, a restating of the order of the universe, or the role of the gods in ordering the universe, or a way of reinforcing and feeding into and sustaining the order of the universe that had been created by the gods and goddesses. So there really is an interesting understanding of poetry, of poetic composition, verse composition, maybe that's a better word, as parallel to the ordering of the cosmos, to the creation of the, or distribution of the many separate beings and physical objects of the universe. In the same way, one can create many words combined in many ways, but according to orderly patterns. It's a way, you could also look at it as a way of keeping chaos at bay through this constant reinforcing of order, tradition, custom, but within it all, a kind of inspired creation. Again, recall these notions of Awan and Nimbus. There is, even deeper within that, a high regard in Indo-European cultures for a notion of truth, and that isn't necessarily a factual versus counterfactual sense of the word truth, but it has something to do with what's being said or what's being done being allied with or tapping into or partaking of an underlying order to things. Probably not too different from the notion of the Tao, right, in Taoist thought, that there is a sort of current to things, and that if you try to name it or if you try to express it literally, you lose it. The Taoist expression is, the Tao that can be named is not the Tao. There is a kind of thought, not unlike that you find in ancient Indo-European culture. It shows up in Vedic India with a concept of rata, RTA, which is actually related to the root that gives us the word art. And it does, in a sense, imply a harmonious, creative thread throughout the cosmos. There's a good book, actually, that covers a lot of this material in a certain sense, called The Artful Universe, by a fellow named Mahoney. And I think that phrase is actually an excellent one to get at what this word refers to, that there is something artful in the very essential nature of the cosmos as we human beings experience it. And we don't get that necessarily directly. We experience it indirectly, and ritual and verses composed and chanted or sung as part of that can be an expression of, can sort of touch on that underlying artfulness. They can be a vehicle for us to glimpse it or to come closer to it, or to feel it manifest for us. There are other similar concepts in European cultures that are Indo-European. The Northern European Germanic peoples had a word, weird, W-Y-R-D, that expressed something similar. It's often understood as meaning something like fate, but it's a bit more than that. It's a kind of a web of creation, kind of an underlying web linking creation and sort of guiding it, dictating its path. At least that's how I understand it. The Greeks had a concept that is more directly translated as fate, moira, M-O-I-R-A, for the Greeks, meant fate, but it was, in a certain sense, a force, or again, maybe you could think of it as a current, to which even the highest of the gods, say Zeus among the Olympians, was subject. That none of the gods was omnipotent, because they were all still subject to this implacable current that you can think of as fate, perhaps. expressed in these various different words that I've thrown at you from the different Indo-European cultures. And so the priest, in enacting the ritual in the appropriate way, in a customary manner, and the various forms of poetic composition and performance that were involved in that were all related to a really deep-seated desire, a spiritual need to reconnect to uphold and support, and to participate in an orderly universe. And an orderly universe that had beneath it an inscrutable nature, looming chaos, right? The Indo-European mythologies are filled with various figures that were opposed to order and with whom the gods had to make war, often at sort of the beginning of time. And those were the sorts of things you wanted to be able to keep at bay or have some measure of control over, or at least create for yourself and for your community a sense that you had carved out at least a bubble of order, of predictability, of certainty. A little patch of sacred order, the order of the gods and goddesses, out of this much larger universe that was filled with both individual beings that were opposed to your interests and also this underlying current that you could not control and could never really know directly. And so the truth of the poet that's referred to is not about the poet describing something in life accurately as you would take a photograph. You could be describing something in real life, in the material cosmos, in the way that an impressionist painting presents it to you. That maybe it gives you a picture that suggests the reality, that suggests the totality, and does it in a way that allows the hearer to experience that reality in a different way. But that the important thing is that it doesn't violate, it doesn't do violence to this sense of order, sense of the traditions of the culture, the notion that one must be in a harmonious relationship with the land, right? It's the work of the poet to reinforce all of that, to tap into the potential to reinforce all of that. And that's the notion of truth that's expressed. The notion that what the poet is saying is aligned with the great way of things, if you will, this underlying current of the universe. It's absolutely true, what I've indicated a few times, that poetry, that verse, was passed down from generation to generation. It wasn't necessarily unchanging. I think I've said this previously in this series. Obviously, a new store of verse, sacred or secular, was added with each generation. But there are certain traditional forms that survive, and not just the meters of specific verse compositions within specific traditions, like, say, the Irish. There are even deeper and sort of unconscious nuggets of Indo-European thought that survive down through the generations. There's a book that's very dense. It's really a sort of a linguistic text, but sort of fascinating if you have some time to kill and you want to, sort of wade through it. And it's called How to Kill a Dragon, and it's by Calvert Watkins, who's a prominent Indo-Europeanist. And one of the things that Watkins points out is the existence of a number of phrases that, first of all, poets in various Indo-European cultures have used time and again down through the generations. They're sort of, you could think of them glibly as stock phrases. The word Watkins and others use is formulaics. They're formulas. And they encapsulate important concepts, important sort of truths, to use that word again, of the various Indo-European societies and their cultures. An interesting one is various phrases in these various languages that translate literally or roughly to the need to, quote, protect men and cattle, unquote. Cattle being, for these ancient cultures, the coin of the realm, if you will. They were the most obvious, most enduring unit of property, of worth. They were essential to the society, not just for meat and dairy products, but also because they served in a certain kind of symbolic way. The cattle raid that you sometimes hear about from particularly Irish tradition was a kind of ritual of kind of trial warfare. It was a way of gathering extra property for your local tribe. It also was an exercise in sort of marshaling the warriors, going out and getting the cattle and bringing them back. What I find interesting in this phrase is the way that it equates men and cattle. That they're not distinguished, they're given equal value in the little phrase. And I think, sort of reflecting on little nuggets of truth like that are always sort of interesting. It's not just protect men, it's not just protect cattle, it's men and cattle. They're both seen as, at least symbolically in this little nugget of verse, they're seen as equals. They're seen as sort of equally present, if not equally important in society. But another one of these formulas that may be actually even more important, particularly from a spiritual standpoint, is a phrase that, again, either literally or roughly translates as imperishable fame, or to use an equivalent expression from the address that's usually given as a eulogy to Robert Burns at Burns Night dinners, the immortal memory. This is something that relates both to the work of the bards and also to a kind of core value of the spirituality of the ancient Celts and other Indo-European peoples. And that is that it was critically important, or at least it was seen as critically important, for these bardic professionals, the Fili, for the bards, to preserve the memory of sort of the heroes of the culture who were past, the kings of the past, the warrior heroes of the past, the people who had helped in some way or another to sustain or protect or preserve the community. It was seen as important to preserve their memory, to, in a certain sense, render them immortal. If you've read the Iliad, or hell, if you've seen the movie Troy, you get a sense around the character of Achilles of the drive for immortality, of the need to achieve a kind of immortality through one's exploits. That was absolutely central to these ancient cultures. And it's interesting because it doesn't necessarily rule out a belief in a literal otherworldly afterlife. But you can certainly look at it from a contemporary perspective as an acknowledgement that the one sure way to achieve immortality is if the people who are still alive are constantly talking about you and speaking well of you when they do. But there's another part to it, and that is that it was important in these traditional cultures to have the essentially court poet on hand who would provide praise for the current king or chief. In a certain sense, you're building up the worthiness, the sense of worthiness, the sense of importance of the most prominent member of the community. And you could look at it in a sense as that you're building up the bank account for when this important person does pass from this world, so that they have already achieved a certain amount of fame, and that then the work of sustaining that fame continues after their death in this plane of existence, if you will. So this was an ongoing enterprise, that those individuals who were seen as most important in protecting the identity, the customs, and most importantly, probably this literal security of the community, were given sort of their due by poets of one form or another. And this practice carries on down well into the historic era. It's like the last vestige of the ancient pre-Christian bardic practices that survived into and past the Renaissance in, say, Ireland, for example, was the practice of praise poetry. That you really, as a notable person in Irish society, needed to have a poet as part of your retinue. It was expected that you maintained a poet. And there's some interesting speculation on whether there may have even been sort of homosexual relationships between patron and poet. That at least the imagery that's linked to the role of the poet in the retinue of the noble is very suggestive of that. I don't tend to think that it should be taken literally. And you find that sort of imagery elsewhere, other than just in, say, Irish society. You find it in English society, patron and poet there too. There's no end of speculation, say, about Shakespeare and whether Shakespeare might have been bisexual because of some of the imagery in his poetry that clearly refers to his patron. Sort of sense of rivalry for affection among Shakespeare and this unnamed dark lady and his male patron, Shakespeare's male patron. So there is a very, very important relationship at play between the noble and the court poet, if you will. And it's also been suggested that the poet stands in as a surrogate for the sovereignty goddess, to whom the noble would be understood to be in relationship, to have been wedded to. Certainly the king in pre-Christian times, and even into Christian times, apparently, in Ireland, would have been wedded to the land. The sovereignty goddess understood as being the instantiation, embodiment of the land itself. And so there is a thought that the poets, even in later times, in fairly recent times, would have been seen explicitly, consciously, unconsciously, who knows, as a surrogate for, as a representative of sovereignty, of the land, and a sort of constant living reminder of the noble's relationship to and needed to continue the harmonious relationship with the land. And seen in that light, some of the imagery that sounds as if it might have a homosexual cast to it may make a certain kind of sense, that it refers back to, in some indirect way perhaps, to the marriage of the noble to the goddess in the land, the sovereignty goddess of the land. The poet could do more than just support the noble. The poet, at least in traditional Irish society, had the ability to destroy the noble. There are any number of references, not only in the law codes, but in the mythology, to the effects of satire performed upon a ruler. It's said that satire could physically blemish the ruler, and tradition tells us that the ruler had to be perfect in his physical appearance. And so a blemish could be cause for the ruler to be removed from the throne. So the poet had a tremendous responsibility to use that tool of satire, poetic satire, responsibly. And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, there are references in the law codes to the banning of satire, at least in certain contexts. I'm not sure I know the entirety of these references, but satire is outlawed in at least certain contexts, as if it were some kind of deadly weapon. And whether you look at it literally or not, whether you really believe that the performance, the utterance of a satire against a ruler would literally physically blemish them, when one understands the sort of importance of personal honor, of personal dignity is probably the better word in this context that I talked about last week in talking about the law codes, damaging one's dignity was equivalent to damaging their status, their worth, their honor, their ability to function in society. And that's, it's just a common sense reaction. That somebody who's been made mock of, or particularly if they're repeatedly made mock of, loses their ability to command respect. Um, Political cartoonists, I think, in contemporary American society, serve a similar function, and maybe late night TV comics. I don't know, talk show hosts. If once there's a cumulative effect, right, that takes hold, then you get sort of a piling on, and the public figure who's being made mock of repeatedly, becomes a vicious circle, and the public at large, the community in general, starts to take that person less seriously as a result. So there is, a real common sense basis to this, to the impact of satire on the noble. Sadly, and I've alluded to this already, we've lost most of these ancient poetic traditions. What we have are sort of scattered references. I've mentioned that the Imbus Verosny was outlawed by Christian authorities, along with another form of poetic divination. A third form that we have a reference to was allowed to be practiced because it was said that one didn't involve invoking demons. And the speculation is that it actually was some sort of technique for divination, or at least for seeking visionary insight, that involved maybe the use of the fingers of the hand. Maybe that was not unlike doing a litany of some sort as a kind of a meditative practice. It didn't involve, though, making offerings or prayers to pagan deities, and so that one was okay. So out of this kind of negative prohibition, we get at least the most cursory reference to three forms of three techniques for seeking poetic inspiration. Were it not for this prohibition by Christian authorities, we might not really have known about at least one of these at all. And the other source for putting some of these pieces together and for fleshing out a picture of ancient bardic customs and practice is what does survive down into historic times in the Celtic lands, both in terms of forms of poetry, meters that did survive, traditional meters that did survive and were still composed in historic times, and what we think we know about the training of the bards and the feelies in historic times. So I'm going to work my way into that, and much of what I have to say for the rest of today will be about that. It'll be about the training, what we know about the training, and a little bit more specific, sort of Celtic-specific material about the place of these professionals within the culture. We know as far back as the classical writers, who I've talked about more than once in the series already, that there were bards among the Druids. When different classes of Druids, different classes of practitioners among the Druidic classes were mentioned, bards were among them. It's understood both from these classical references and from what we glean from later bardic training manuals that enormous quantities of verses had to be mastered. That this wasn't just a matter of being taught techniques to compose, that first you had to learn what had gone before. Now, partly I think that's to do with acquiring the traditions and acquiring the culture, getting the material, the history, the genealogies, the praise poetry, getting what had been written and recited previously about important figures in the culture into yourself as a body of material, of raw material, which you would be able to work with later. But also, it was a way of mastering, acquiring and mastering the traditional forms of composition that were valued by the culture. It's a little bit like if you're learning to be a painter, copying the styles of various famous painters, doing reproductions of their work, copying the Mona Lisa. You're not going to paint in that style for the rest of your life, and you're certainly not undertaking doing that sort of copyist work because you want to spend the rest of your life painting like Raphael You're doing it because these were successful artists in the past who had mastered certain approaches to representing reality artistically. And so by going through the exercise of moving your brush from the palette to the canvas and on the palette in the way that these masters had before, you were showing yourself. You were experiencing for yourself how they work, what genius was doing when genius did its work. It's, I think, analogous to memorize and recite the poetic works of masters who've gone before. You may not get to experience in the same way that you would by copying a painting the work of creating the verse. You don't get to recompose it. It's one of the problems with literature. As opposed to visual art, you can't make a replica of it in the same way. But you do at least get to put the material into yourself, at least go through it sort of linearly, acquire it. So at least in that way, you're putting these the works of masters who have gone before you into yourself, so that you're expanding your toolkit, if you will. The evidence certainly suggests that it was 100% oral, at least in pre-Christian times, particularly because it is suggested that the Celts did have writing. They could have written this stuff down had they chosen to, and they didn't choose to. And that, that difficulty is reflected in the fact that it took certainly over a dozen years to reach a level of mastery. And as Caesar notes, 20 years to become a Druid. We have texts related to the training of the poets from the Middle Ages that suggest 12 years or more. I think there are different spans of time in different texts. I'm not 100% sure of what they are, but we're talking about more than a dozen years of training, and of a fairly highly specialized kind of training. And that was a lifestyle training. Right? It wasn't just something you did during the day. It wasn't something you did at night. It wasn't something you did on the weekend while you did other things. Right? You wouldn't have a day job. I mean, this is what you did. This is what society helped to sustain you in. In later times, it's how you would acquire a patron because you had demonstrated mastery. And the better you were, and the more the community recognized your work, the more likely you were to end up as the court poet of a particularly important noble. So the society recognized the importance of supporting and sustaining this institution. It was an indispensable part of the culture, which is one of the things that seems most alien to me as a modern American, the kind of anti-artistic, anti-intellectual current that runs through this culture. It's hard to imagine our American society undertaking to support the training over many years of poets. We're suspicious in this culture. I shouldn't say we in the sense of me, because I'm not, but I think our official institutions and much of our society is a little bit suspicious of the academic, of those people who are in quote-unquote ivory towers. There is a kind of, I won't say stigma. Stigma's maybe strong, although there's a stigma in certain quarters. But there is a kind of suspicion and maybe an undervaluing of that. But I think more, sort of more to the point, there's definitely a negative stereotype around artists, that they're bohemian and profligate and hedonistic, and they don't support themselves. And the reality is, it's hard to support yourself as an artist because the society that we live in these days doesn't value the role of the artist in the community. In ancient Celtic culture, in traditional Celtic culture, at least the Bardic classes were indispensable. They were absolutely central to the functioning of the culture, and they had to be sustained. And one of the things that English culture did in Ireland that was probably most destructive was suppress institutions of the Gaelic culture, like the Bardic schools. This institution existed, I think, in one form or another in all of the Indo-European cultures, but the Gaelic culture, and I suppose it's fair to say it was probably true in Wales as well, maintained this institution in a certain kind of way that was that had a religious component to it, I think, or maybe spiritual is a better way to put it, probably far longer than was the case elsewhere. Just to reiterate, a lot of the words that have to do with this work do relate to the notion of visionary work. The word Fili, Fila being a poet, the elevated poet in Ireland, relates to seer. The Oate, or Ovate, if you will, and the Uates, which is a Celtic spelling of it, is a related word. They're etymologically related, and they have to do with vision. And even the German name for the god, who we often hear referred to as Odin, which was Woden, from which we get Wednesday, Woden actually is a related word. It's related to that word Oate that referred to the visionary, divinatory priest among the Druids. And if you consider the mythology around Odin or Woden as a seer god, one who, in the Scandinavian version, sacrifices one eye for divinatory sight, you can see a sort of a connection. There's a connective tissue there, that there was an understanding that one of the roles that these people played was ecstatic and visionary, that they were the ones who, after all these years of training, were expected to be able to, in a certain sense, and this is maybe a more contemporary way of putting it than they would have ever put it, touch the divine or see the divine. I'm going to focus on Ireland for a little bit now, and then I will touch on Wales, just briefly towards the end. We don't have much of anything that's sort of demonstrably pre-Christian among the Irish verses that survive to us. The most likely candidates are verses that are called Rosc, R-O-S-C, that we find within mythological narratives. If you look at most of the really notable Irish myths, the tales that were preserved by Christian scribes in the Middle Ages, you'll be tooling along reading prose, and then all of a sudden there'll be a recapitulation of what was just said in a very lengthy verse. It's fair to say that those are probably of pagan origin, but many of them are sort of dressed up or sanitized by virtue of the fact that they were recorded by Christian clerics many centuries after they were probably originally composed. Some of our earliest verse in Irish comes from Christian clerics, and were in fact Christian in content. A lot of people like to call attention to the interesting fact that much of them deal with nature imagery. You can make of that probably what you will. A lot of people have used it to suggest that the Celtic Christian church, to the extent that that phrase has any meaning, may have retained some kind of pagan sensibility that related to a reverence or at least high regard for the natural environment. I don't know that that's really true. I think Christians were perfectly capable of seeing the importance of their God's creation and extolling its virtue. And so there's a little bit of a chicken or the egg factor there. But certainly it's fair to say that Celtic verse tradition absolutely did have a regard for the natural environment in it. What the source of that is, we probably don't know, for the simple reason that we just don't have any of the really old verses. Most of what we have comes to us from Christianity and from the Christian traditions. The verse that survives comes from probably no earlier than the 6th century, the current era, and none of it was really set down until much later, because none of the manuscripts date from any earlier than several centuries after that. We do have, as I've said, texts from the Middle Ages that outline some of the training of the poets. One of them is called the Order Kept Nanekish, A-U-R-I-C-E-P-T-N-A, and then N, usually N hyphen, E-C-E-S. Within this text, you'll find references to the Ogham alphabet, or some people say Ogham alphabet, in various forms. It's unclear exactly what the relationship of these alphabets and systems of alphabets were to the work of the poets. We do know that they were required to learn a certain number of these. There's also a provocative, interesting, and obscure reference that says in one of the years of the poets' training they were to learn the secret language of the poets, which I think is Burla Fili, if I remember correctly. Just what that secret language was, we don't know, and we probably will never know. And it's inspired no end of speculation as to what it was, the possible relationship of these Ogham or Ogham alphabets to it, the various correspondences between letters in these alphabets and features in the natural world or the human body or human society. There's bird Ogham, there's fortress Ogham, river Ogham, the familiar tree alphabet, and so on. And unfortunately, there's a lot of room for speculation, but no real hard evidence as to what the relationship might have been. We have evidence, which apparently I've been told is disputed, for what you can call incubatory practice, right? Of the poet in training going into a darkened cell, having taken in whatever raw material, whether it's verses that have been memorized by others, whether it's what's been seen and experienced in the countryside and the community, and then in this cell, in isolation, composing and being expected to come forth and produce finished verses. Just as an aside, there's at least one suggestion that as the poet lay in the darkened chamber incubating these poems, a stone was placed on their midsection, their center, where their key would be from an Oriental perspective, or solar plexus. And there is a notion that that was some sort of attempt to control or influence breathing as part of literal inspiration. If you think about where the word inspire comes from, as compared with respire. I mentioned this in passing last week, and I'll reiterate it now. Irish society, as most Indo-European societies were stratified. There were castes, if you will, classes, if you will. The poet advanced through various grades towards mastery throughout the training. We have words like das, cli, anra, and ultimately the master's level, the olive, O-L-L-A-M-H, or as you'll see it in English spelling, sometimes O-L-L-A-V-E. And as I think I've mentioned before, that remains a term for professor in Irish, in the sense of somebody who has mastered the discipline. It's progressed as far as they can go. That's actually a very important word in Irish society, the olive. It's as I say, the level of mastery. And it is somebody who is qualified to teach as the professor. To reiterate something that I've talked about previously, throughout the Christian era in Ireland and elsewhere in the Celtic world, gradually the religious component of all of this Bardic practice fell away because it wasn't fully harmonious with Christian dogma, Christian practice. It wasn't needed in the same way. But that basic, fundamental role of the poet as providing praise poetry, eulogy, couldn't be dispensed with. And so that role continues down through the Middle Ages and into more contemporary times. So we know very little about what the sort of religious and ritual role of the ancient poets would have been. We know more about the role that they played in sustaining the worthies of the society, of the community, of extolling their virtue, as I've indicated previously, and then eulogizing them, memorializing them after death, and also the need to recite genealogies, the importance attached to what's gone before, and the role of poets in preserving that. But not only the religious role of the poets fell away over time, but also a lot of the institutions that supported the practice of poetic composition fell away. The formal schools diminished, the number of them, and sort of the physical institutions that supported them fell away. The institution of competition, a formal competition, fell away. And yet it didn't disappear completely. And I'd recommend, if you want to sort of read more fully into this, a book called The Hidden Ireland. Fascinating book, I think, that talks about the informal Bardic competitions, poetic competitions that happened after the 17th century, where there was still gatherings of poets and there was still competitions, but they took place in places like taverns, and there was still a mechanism for mastery and apprenticeship, and the traditions were still struggling to survive, and were still kind of hanging on, and were still being passed on from generation to generation, but without the support of the official institutions of the society, because English culture didn't want Gaelic culture to continue to flower. It was as much a political thing as anything else. And ultimately it succeeded in basically wiping out these institutions. But they struggled on in sort of debased form. An analogous thing can be found in terms of the education of the young in the Gaelic world. The hedge school was a response to the outlawing of Gaelic as a medium for instruction of the young. There couldn't be physical schoolhouses where Gaelic could be taught. You could be punished for doing this. And so there were, instead of specific sites for schools, there would be itinerant schoolmasters who would go and set up shop where they could, and pupils would come to them, and they would be paid by people in the local community, sustained by people locally, in order to teach non-English speaking children in the language that they knew, in the Irish language, in Gaelic. That image, if you can kind of wrap your head around that, is, as I say, pretty analogous to the situation with the training of the poets. So if you think back to the picture that Caesar presents of 20 years of training, and that picture is supported and reinforced by the evidence from the Middle Ages of these literally hundreds, if not thousands, of verses that had to be memorized over a period of years, and the importance of that in the religion of the community, the spiritual life of the community, and you look at what it whittles down to and trickles down to in the 17th and 18th centuries, it's a little sad, but it's also a testament to just how important those institutions were in the culture, that they still struggle on, they still survive, and that the people in the individual community still attached so much importance to it, that, as with the hedge schools, they would risk punishment, legal punishment, to continue to carry on the institution, to continue to advance the use of their language and their culture. It's in that era that we start to get a clear historic picture of the harpers, of the harp players. Harpers, interestingly, were relatively low status in the law codes. The Feely, right, the trained poet, the court poet, if you will, was pretty high up. It was near the top in terms of their status under the law in the traditional law codes. The harper was, down with various artisans. They were seen as lower status, which I find interesting. And I don't know all the history of it, or even if there is any sort of history of it, but there certainly are references to the use of the harp by the ancient Feely. In the mythology, there's reference to various strains, probably analogous to modes that could be played on the harp that would induce laughter or sleep or sadness. So there's definitely an ancient tradition of harp playing, and it's even attributed to the Tuatha the gods of the Irish. They had harpers among their society, and even one or more of the gods are noted as being masters of the harp. And yet, in the historic era, the harp has a lower status. The harp player has a lower status in society, and I don't know whether that's a byproduct of the Christianization of the culture, and that there was perhaps at some point in Irish history an association of the harp with pagan religion, or whether it's just a sort of a natural evolution that took place, that the harpist, along with the druid and others, just gradually found their way down to be valued somewhat in society. But it's fair to say, at least, that there is a very ancient history of the harp in Irish society. And when we get into the more recent era, the bard, the one remaining sort of practitioner in Anglo-Irish culture of these ancient traditions, the bard is essentially a harp player. And they've lost, as we get into the 18th century, they've lost the ancient meters. No one's composing in the ancient poetic meters anymore. The material is now secular. And we find ourselves into what we would think of maybe loosely as the minstrel. And the shanachie, storyteller. So the itinerant harper and the itinerant storyteller or shanachie, as we get into the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, are sort of what's left of a tradition that is central to the culture and goes back more than 2,000 years. Certain things like the sean-nós singing, the traditional a cappella singing, and that you find particularly in the west of Ireland and the northwest of Ireland, that's pretty ancient. Those melodies are probably reflective of some of the oldest musical traditions in Ireland. Some of the harp tunes, probably true, although I don't know how much of harp composition is influenced by outside composition, because the stuff that survives to us comes from like post 17th century. But again, as I say, I'm not real well versed in music history of Celtic countries. But there are suppositions about how old some of these forms are in popular culture, popular imagination, and generally speaking, they're wildly overstated. They're much more recent inventions or imports, and don't go back as far as people might imagine or want to imagine they do. As in other areas, the tradition in Wales is more recent, at least in terms of the material that survives to us, than in Ireland. Whereas we're pretty comfortable thinking that some of the verses that survive to us weren't written down in the 6th century, but were probably being recited in the 6th century. In other words, they were preserved from forms that were extant in the 6th century. Nothing in Wales can be conclusively said to be pre-9th century. So, probably at least 200, 300, maybe 400 years more recent than the Irish material. That said, in some respects, Wales preserved a more visible, more prominent Bardic tradition than Ireland did. I think ironically, in some respects, that has to do with how early Wales came under English domination. And probably, although I may be wrong in this, but I'm willing to bet that this is true, some of it had to do with the fact that Welsh heritage at times was in vogue in the English court. In particular, Elizabeth I was cagey about linking herself via her Welsh ancestry through the Tudor lineage back to King Arthur. There was an attempt to link the British crown, the crown of Great Britain, the throne of Great Britain, to the myths and legends of King Arthur. And King Arthur was understood as, in some sense, being associated with Wales. So there were times when, even though Welsh culture was being suppressed in the same way that Irish culture was being suppressed, the notion of, let's say, Welsh cultural institutions as being valuable was around. There were reasons why the British Crown should not wipe out the cultural institutions of the Welsh. And consequently, you see institutions like the Eisteddfod, which is the competition of poets, surviving down through the years. I think it died out at some point and was revived in more modern times. But there's always been a kind of a conscious interest in the poetic, which is to say Bardic traditions of Wales, in a way that there never really was in the minds of the surrounding cultures like the English or the Irish traditions. The Irish traditions were politically suspicious, potentially rallying points for insurrection, and were pretty actively suppressed. The Welsh traditions were suppressed only in as much as Wales itself came under English domination quite early, like the 13th century, in some ways much earlier than Ireland did. We have a body of verse that's usually referred to as Bardic from Wales, and a number of purported poets like Myrddin, which is the Welsh spelling for Merlin. And so there's an association sometimes with the legendary Merlin, and all sorts of ideas, notions about whether they're one and the same or not. Probably not. There's Taliesin, which was a mythological figure, certainly a legendary figure, inspired poet whose name meant shining brow, which is also the name of one or more Bardic poets whose works have been collected in some of the manuscripts. I say one or more because there probably were more than one author of some of these poems that were collected under the name Taliesin, that were purported to be authored by Taliesin. And there are others. One of the most important works in the British language is Gododdin, which is a very lengthy battle poem that records skirmishes along the border between Britain, which would be to say Wales, ancient Wales, and Scotland. Probably the most important literary material that comes down to us from Wales are the four branches of the Mabinogi, so-called Mabinogion. And those are quite recent compared to the mythic tales of the Irish, so recent that they exist in a kind of literary form that the Irish materials don't. The Irish materials have the flavor of, and for good reason, having been preserved from much earlier versions by the scribes in the monasteries, whereas the tales in the Mabinogion are much more finished and much more literary, and they're related to the minstrel traditions that flourished in Brittany and elsewhere. So they're more tales that could be read as much as recited. And so there's always some lingering doubt as to the degree to which they really represent what would have been the pre-Christian mythic traditions of the Welsh people, the Britons.